I was standing in front of dozens of guests when my daughter-in-law laughed into the microphone and called me a freeloader. In that moment, every sacrifice I had ever made, every dollar I had given, every night I stayed awake worrying about my son's future felt erased. People smiled. Some even laughed. My own son looked away. I held a gift in my hands that could have changed their lives forever, and suddenly I realized they never saw me as a blessing, only as a burden. That was the night I stopped staying silent, and everything changed. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Linda Matthews, and I was 62 years old when I packed up the last of my belongings and moved into my son's house in Scottsdale, Arizona. It was not something I had ever imagined for myself. For most of my adult life, I had been independent, steady, and quietly proud of the life my husband Roger and I had built together. We worked, we saved, we planned. Then, one winter morning, a stroke took him from me without warning, and everything I understood about stability disappeared overnight. After the funeral, the house felt too large and too silent. Every room echoed with memories I was not ready to face alone. Ethan offered that I come live with him and his wife, Melissa, for a while. At the time, it sounded like kindness. I told myself it would be temporary. I believed I would stay only until I found my footing again. Their house was beautiful. It sat in a quiet suburban neighborhood with palm trees lining the sidewalks and manicured lawns that looked untouched by real life. There was a small swimming pool in the backyard and wide windows that filled the living room with sunlight. It was the kind of home people worked years to afford. I felt grateful to be welcomed into it. My room, however, was different. It had once been a storage space, converted hurriedly into something that resembled a bedroom. The ceiling was lower than the rest of the house, and the single window faced a blank wall. I had a narrow bed, a folding desk, and a small closet that never quite closed properly. I told myself it was enough. I kept everything neat and minimal, afraid that taking up too much space would feel like asking for too much. Every morning, I woke before anyone else. I made coffee, packed lunches, and prepared breakfast for my grandchildren. I walked them to the bus stop, waved as they climbed aboard, and returned home to clean the kitchen and straighten the living room. In the afternoons, I folded laundry, ran errands, and started dinner. No one asked me to do these things. No one stopped me either. Over time, they simply became expected. I did not mind at first. Being useful made me feel secure. It gave me a purpose. I also contributed financially, quietly. Every month, I transferred money to help with utilities, groceries, and school expenses. When something broke, I paid for repairs without mentioning it. I never wrote notes on the transfers. I never asked for acknowledgement. I believed family should not keep score. Ethan had changed since his teenage years. He was always tired now, always distracted by work and bills and responsibilities. He loved me. I knew that, but he rarely had time to show it. Melissa was polite and composed. She spoke gently, smiled often, and managed the household with careful efficiency. Yet there was a distance in her kindness, a subtle reminder that this was her home, not mine. I tried hard not to be a problem. I stayed out of arguments. I avoided giving opinions unless asked. I learned to move quietly through the house, as if my presence might disturb the balance. Sometimes, in the evenings, I sat alone in my small room and wondered when I had started feeling invisible. Dinners went on without waiting for me. Decisions were made without consulting me. Plans unfolded as though I were not part of them. Still, I told myself I was imagining things. This was what mothers did, I thought. We stepped back. We made room. We sacrificed without complaint. At least, that was what I believed then. If you're still watching and starting to feel the quiet pain behind the story, please comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. This is only the beginning, and what happens next will reveal how small moments can turn into deep wounds. Now let's move on to chapter 2. At first, I told myself nothing had changed. Life moved quickly in Ethan and Melissa's house. There were schedules, meetings, school events, and endless notifications buzzing from their phones. It seemed natural that I sometimes fell out of the loop. I assumed it was simply part of living with younger people who had fuller calendars and louder priorities. I did not want to be the kind of mother who complained about feeling ignored. So, I stayed quiet. The first time I felt truly excluded was over their vacation. One afternoon, while folding laundry in the living room, I noticed photos appearing on Melissa's social media. Blue water, white sand, smiling faces under wide Hawaiian skies. Ethan and the children stood barefoot on the beach, arms around each other, looking relaxed and happy. I stared at the screen longer than I meant to. No one had mentioned a trip. That evening, I casually asked about it. Ethan looked surprised for a moment, then said they had planned it quickly and assumed I would not want to travel. Melissa added that there had not been enough space anyway. Their explanations were smooth and reasonable. I nodded and said I understood. I even meant it, at least on the surface. But later, alone in my room, I wondered why I had not even been given the choice. Not long after that, I lost my car. I had owned that old sedan for more than 10 years. It was nothing special, but it was mine. One morning, I noticed it was gone from the driveway. Ethan explained that he had sold it because repairs were becoming expensive and thought it would be easier for everyone if I just used their second car. He said he had done it for my benefit. I thanked him. Only later did it occur to me that no one had asked what I wanted. The moment that stayed with me the most happened late one evening. I had gone to the kitchen for a glass of water. The lights were off, and I moved quietly, not wanting to wake anyone. That was when I heard Melissa's voice from the other room, low and irritated. She was on the phone. "She is basically freeloading," she said. "I mean, she lives here, eats here, and barely contributes." I froze. I stood there in the dark, holding an empty glass, afraid that even my breathing might give me away. Ethan's voice drifted through the doorway. He said nothing to disagree, nothing to defend me, just a tired sound of agreement. I returned to my room without the water. That night, I did not sleep. I lay awake, replaying the word in my mind. Freeloader. It felt sharp and heavy, like something dropped onto my chest. I thought of every bill I had paid, every meal I had cooked, every afternoon I had spent waiting at bus stops. I wondered how all of that had become invisible. For days afterward, I questioned myself. Maybe I really was a burden. Maybe I had stayed too long. Maybe my presence was an inconvenience they were too polite to address directly. Still, I did not confront them. Instead, I began to watch more closely. I noticed how conversations stopped when I entered a room, how plans were finalized without me, how Melissa referred to the house as ours, never ours, including Mom. I noticed how easy it had become for them to forget I was there. One evening, while searching for old paperwork, I opened a drawer I had not touched in years. Inside were documents from another life, property records, bank statements, letters from Roger. Among them was the file for the land in Flagstaff. I ran my fingers over the folder. For the first time in a long while, I remembered that I had once been more than a guest in someone else's home. I had built things. I had owned things. I had mattered. I was still silent. But inside me, something had begun to shift. If you're still watching and you can sense how everything is slowly falling apart, please comment number 2 below to let me know you're with me. What she discovers next will change the way she sees her own family forever. Now, let's move on to chapter 3. After the night I heard myself described as a burden, something inside me began to close. I still moved through the house the same way. I still cooked, cleaned, and smiled when spoken to. But I stopped sharing my thoughts. I stopped talking about my worries or my plans. I learned to keep my feelings folded neatly inside, where no one could dismiss them. In the quiet moments of the day, I began thinking about what would happen if I had to leave. I had spent so long believing that this house was my safety net that I had forgotten I once had one of my own. When Ethan and Melissa were at work and the children were at school, I sat alone in my small room and looked through old folders, searching for pieces of the life I had built before I became invisible. That was when I found the documents again. The land in Flagstaff had been Roger's idea. More than 20 years earlier, when Ethan was still in college and money was tight, Roger had insisted that we invest in something that would outlast us. We saved every extra dollar. We skipped vacations, repaired old appliances instead of replacing them, and lived below our means. Eventually, we bought a modest plot of land near the pine forests outside Flagstaff. We dreamed of building a small cabin there someday. Life, however, had other plans. Work, medical bills, and family responsibilities kept pushing that dream further away. When Roger died, the land became something different. It was no longer a future home. It was a reminder of everything we had hoped for and never reached. I kept it. I paid the taxes. I filed the paperwork. I never considered selling it. It felt wrong to let go of the last thing we had built together. One afternoon, out of curiosity, I searched online for recent property values in the area. What I found made my hands tremble. Over the years, development had spread outward. New resorts, hiking lodges, and vacation homes had transformed the region. The land we had bought for a modest price was now worth more than $1 million. I stared at the screen for a long time. I had never thought of myself as wealthy. I still did not. But I realized then that I was not powerless either. For months, I had carried an idea quietly in my heart. I wanted to give the land to Ethan. I imagined handing him the deed on his 15th anniversary, telling him it was his father's and mine, passed down with love. I pictured relief on his face, stability, gratitude. I wanted to help him without standing in his way, so I began preparing. I contacted the county office. I requested updated records. I arranged for an official appraisal. I gathered every document into a thick folder and sealed it in a plain envelope. I hid it at the back of my dresser drawer, beneath folded sweaters. No one knew. Then, one evening, everything shifted. Melissa had left her laptop open on the kitchen counter while she stepped outside to take a call. As I passed by, I saw an email thread on the screen. A law office. Subject lines about inheritance, property rights, and spousal protection. My name was not mentioned. Instead, the messages referred to my husband's mother's assets. I read only a few lines before my stomach tightened. She had been asking how ownership could be transferred, how property could be secured, how risks could be minimized, without ever speaking to me. I returned to my room and closed the door quietly. That night, I sat on my bed holding the envelope with the land documents inside. For the first time, I wondered whether the gift I planned to give was truly wanted or merely expected. My trust, once unquestioned, had begun to crack. If you're still watching and shocked by what she has been hiding all this time, please comment number 3 below to let me know you're with me. The truth is about to collide with betrayal in a way no one expected. Now let's move on to chapter 4. After discovering Melissa's emails, I spent several days pretending I had never seen them. I told myself that I had misunderstood, that legal questions did not always mean bad intentions, that maybe she was only trying to be responsible. I reminded myself that suspicion could destroy families faster than truth ever could. More than anything, I was afraid that if I confronted her, I would lose what little place I still had in their lives. So I chose silence again. Instead of asking questions, I focused on preparing for Ethan and Melissa's 15th wedding anniversary. The celebration was going to be held at a resort outside the city, and Melissa wanted everything to look perfect. She created color themes, seating charts, and guest lists weeks in advance. I offered to help wherever I could. I drove to stores to pick up decorations. I folded invitations. I watched the children for hours while they met with event planners. I wanted to prove that I was useful. In my room, I began preparing my gift. I took out the envelope with the land documents and checked each page carefully. The appraisal, the deed, the transfer forms, everything was in order. I placed them inside a sturdy box and wrapped it in simple cream-colored paper. No ribbons, no flashy bows, just clean folds and quiet intention. It felt strange to hold so much value in my hands without anyone knowing. As the date approached, I pushed myself harder. I woke earlier. I stayed up later. I cooked extra meals and cleaned rooms that no one had asked me to clean. When my body ached, I ignored it. When exhaustion crept in, I brushed it aside. I kept hearing that word in my head. Freeloader. I wanted to erase it with effort. A few days before the event, Melissa stopped me in the hallway. She smiled politely, the way she always did when she was about to give instructions. She told me it would be better if I did not make any speeches at the celebration. She said people preferred things to stay light and simple. She also suggested that I wear something neutral, nothing too noticeable. I nodded. I told her I understood. But that night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling for hours. Her words replayed in my mind. Stay simple, stay quiet, stay small. Part of me wanted to pack my bags and leave before the weekend arrived. I even looked up apartment listings on my phone, scrolling through the small studios and senior housing communities. I imagined living alone again, cooking only for myself, making decisions without worrying about disturbing anyone. Then I thought of Ethan as a little boy, standing at the edge of a soccer field, searching for me in the crowd. I remembered the nights I stayed awake beside his bed when he had fevers, the years I spent working extra shifts to send him to college. I was not ready to give up. On the morning of the celebration, I dressed slowly. I chose a modest blue dress and low heels. I brushed my hair carefully and applied just enough makeup to look presentable without standing out. I picked up the wrapped box and held it against my chest for a moment. It felt heavier than it should have. As we drove toward the resort, I watched the desert landscape pass by the window. The mountains stood silent in the distance, unmoved by human worries. I wondered, quietly, whether I was walking toward reconciliation or toward something that would change everything. I had no answer yet. If you're still watching and feeling the tension building, please comment number 4 below to let me know you're with me. The next chapter contains the moment that will shatter everything she believed about her family. Now, let's move on to chapter 5. The resort rose from the desert like something out of a postcard. Tall glass windows reflected the late afternoon sun, and soft music drifted through the open entrance. White fabric was draped along the walkways, and small lanterns lined the paths leading to the outdoor reception area. Everything had been arranged with careful precision. It was beautiful. It was expensive. It was far beyond anything I would have chosen for myself. I stepped out of the car with the wrapped box held tightly in both hands. For a moment, I stood still, taking in the scene. Guests in tailored suits and elegant dresses moved easily through the space, greeting one another with practiced smiles. Servers carried silver trays filled with champagne glasses. Laughter floated through the warm air. I felt like I had wandered into someone else's life. Inside the reception area, Ethan and Melissa were surrounded almost immediately. Melissa looked radiant. Her hair was perfectly styled, her dress shimmering softly under the lights. She moved from group to group with confidence, laughing at jokes and touching arms lightly as she spoke. Ethan stood beside her, smiling when necessary, nodding when spoken to, his attention scattered. Neither of them noticed me at first. I stayed near the edge of the crowd, close to a tall potted plant, unsure where I belonged. A few guests passed by without acknowledging me. One woman asked if I knew where the restrooms were. A man assumed I was part of the staff and handed me an empty glass. I accepted it automatically, then realized what had happened too late. I placed the glass on a nearby table and retreated further into the background. When Melissa finally saw me, she smiled briefly and gestured toward me with her hand, as if introducing an object rather than a person. She did not use my name. She simply referred to me as Ethan's mom and returned to her conversation. I reminded myself that I was there to celebrate them. After dinner, the lights dimmed slightly and soft music faded into the background. Melissa took the microphone, her posture straight and confident. The crowd quieted. She began by thanking everyone for coming. She spoke about their journey, their challenges, their love. People listened attentively, nodding and smiling. Then her tone shifted. With a light laugh, she mentioned how difficult it had been to manage everything over the years. She joked about bills, responsibilities, and extra mouths to feed. Her eyes flicked briefly in my direction. She said that supporting family was important, even when it meant carrying someone who did not always contribute. A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd. I felt it before I understood it. My ears rang. My hands went numb. For a moment, I could not move. I could not breathe properly. I stood there, frozen, as strangers laughed at a version of me that had been twisted into something unrecognizable. I looked at Ethan. He stared at the floor. No correction, no defense, just silence. I thought of every early morning, every late night, every dollar transferred without comment, every sacrifice made without complaint. None of it mattered in that moment. I wanted to disappear. Then unexpectedly, a familiar voice cut through the noise. It belonged to Margaret, an old friend from my neighborhood years ago. She had not seen me in a long time and had been invited through mutual connections. Smiling warmly, she called out how proud she was of me. She mentioned how I had once saved Ethan from financial disaster when his business collapsed, how I had emptied my savings to help him rebuild. Her words were casual, unplanned. The laughter faded. Whispers replaced it. Melissa's smile faltered. Ethan's head lifted slowly. I remained still, holding my box, feeling every eye in the room turn toward me. For the first time that evening, I understood that I could no longer stay silent. The silence that followed Margaret's words felt heavier than any accusation. It settled over the reception area like a thick blanket, pressing against my chest and making every breath feel deliberate. Conversations stopped. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Even the soft background music seemed distant, as if it were coming from another room entirely. For the first time that evening, everyone was looking at me. I stood there holding the wrapped box, my fingers tightening around its edges. My heart raced, yet my thoughts were strangely clear. In that moment, I understood that this was not just about one joke or one careless comment. It was about years of being quiet, years of shrinking myself to fit into a space where I was never meant to be small. Part of me wanted to let it pass. I could smile politely, pretend it had not hurt, and go back to my familiar role. I could protect the fragile peace of our family by sacrificing my dignity once again. That had always been my instinct. Avoid conflict. Keep things smooth. Endure. But another voice, long ignored, began to speak inside me. It reminded me of Roger's steady hands and unwavering honesty. It reminded me of the woman I had been before I learned to apologize for existing. It reminded me that silence had never protected me. It had only made me easier to overlook. Before I could change my mind, I stepped forward. The sound of my shoes against the stone floor seemed unusually loud. Each step felt deliberate, final. I climbed the small platform where Melissa had been standing moments earlier and placed the box on the table beside the microphone. My hands trembled slightly as I removed the paper. Inside were the documents I had prepared in secret: the official deed, the professional appraisal, the transfer forms, already notarized and ready to be signed. I arranged them neatly, smoothing the edges as though order might steady my nerves. I did not raise my voice. I simply explained what they were. I told them about the land in Flagstaff, about how Roger and I had bought it decades earlier with dreams of building something lasting, about how I had kept it through every hardship, about how its value had grown quietly while I lived just as quietly. I told them that I had planned to give it to Ethan, not as leverage, not as a favor, as a gift, as a way of saying that I believed in him, that I trusted him, that I wanted his future to be secure. I looked at my son as I spoke. For a brief second, our eyes met. I saw confusion, then realization, then something close to fear. He finally understood what he had been about to receive. He also understood what he was about to lose. I gathered the papers back into a stack. Slowly, carefully, I slid them back into the envelope. I said that gifts were meant to be given freely, not demanded through disrespect. That support did not mean submission. That love did not require humiliation. I said that I would not hand over something built on a lifetime of sacrifice to people who could not see my worth. Melissa's face drained of color. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it again. No one spoke. I placed the envelope inside the box and closed the lid. Without another word, I stepped down from the platform. I walked past rows of stunned faces, past whispering guests, past servers who suddenly did not know where to look. I did not search for Ethan. I did not wait for Melissa. I did not pause to explain myself further. Outside, the desert air felt cool against my skin. I inhaled deeply, feeling both shattered and strangely light. Everything had changed, and for the first time in years, I had chosen myself. If you're still watching and stunned by the choice she just made, please comment number 6 below to let me know you're with me. What follows will expose a betrayal even deeper than anyone imagined. Now, let's move on to Chapter 7. I left the resort without looking back. The parking lot was nearly empty, the desert wind brushing against my face as if trying to cool the fire still burning in my chest. My hands shook when I unlocked the car. Only after I sat behind the wheel did I realize how exhausted I was. The strength that had carried me through the evening faded all at once, leaving behind a deep, aching heaviness. I drove home in silence. When I reached the house, every light was off. The familiar quiet no longer felt comforting. It felt hollow. I placed the box on my bed and sat beside it, staring at the wall for a long time. I did not cry. I felt strangely numb, as though my emotions were waiting for permission to surface. In the days that followed, the story spread faster than I expected. Friends called with hesitant voices. Distant relatives sent short messages asking if I was all right. Even neighbors I barely knew seemed aware that something had happened at the anniversary celebration. People talked. They speculated. They chose sides. I stayed out of it. Meanwhile, Ethan's life began to unravel. I learned through mutual acquaintances that some of his business partners had grown uneasy. They questioned his honesty. Meetings were postponed. Contracts were reviewed. A few opportunities quietly disappeared. Melissa, once admired for her confidence, became the subject of whispered criticism. I did not feel satisfied by any of it. What hurt most came a week later. One afternoon, I found a thick envelope in the mailbox addressed to me. It bore the logo of a regional bank. Inside was a formal notice regarding a loan in my name. It listed overdue payments and potential legal consequences. My heart sank. I called the number immediately. After a long wait, a representative confirmed what I feared. Ethan had taken out a substantial loan months earlier, using me as a guarantor. My signature had been digitally attached to the documents through an authorization process I barely remembered. He had never explained the details. I had trusted him when he said he needed help with some paperwork. He had put my financial security at risk without telling me. That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the letter until the words blurred. This was no longer about hurt feelings or careless jokes. This was betrayal in its clearest form. The next morning, I scheduled an appointment with a lawyer. She reviewed the documents carefully and helped me file the necessary paperwork to remove myself from the obligation. It was a complicated process, but it was possible. For the first time in years, I chose to protect myself without hesitation. When I returned home, I began packing. I folded my clothes neatly. I gathered photographs, books, and letters. I placed everything into simple cardboard boxes. I did not make a scene. I did not announce my departure. I moved quietly, the way I always had. Ethan called repeatedly. I let the phone ring. Melissa sent one short email, polite and distant, asking if we could talk things through. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what she had done. I did not respond. A small apartment on the other side of town had already been waiting for me. When I carried the last box out of the house, Sorry. I paused briefly at the doorway. Then I closed it behind me. I understood then that distance was not punishment. It was protection. My new apartment was small, quiet, and filled with sunlight. It sat on the third floor of a modest senior community on the east side of town, surrounded by flowering shrubs and narrow walking paths. There was no swimming pool, no grand entrance, no carefully curated image to maintain. There was only peace. For the first time in years, I lived in a place where every corner belonged to me. The first few weeks felt strange. I woke up without rushing to prepare breakfast for anyone else. I drank my coffee slowly by the window. I chose when to leave and when to stay inside. No one expected anything from me. No one evaluated my usefulness. At first, the freedom felt almost uncomfortable, like a coat that did not quite fit yet. Gradually, I learned to relax into it. I slept better. The tension in my shoulders eased. My thoughts became quieter. I began walking in the mornings, following the same path around the garden each day, listening to birds and distant traffic. I started reading again, something I had nearly forgotten how to enjoy. I cooked meals that suited my taste, not anyone else's schedule. In those quiet moments, I reflected on my past. For decades, I had measured my worth by how much I could give. I had believed that love meant endurance, that being a good mother meant disappearing into other people's needs. I did not regret raising my son with devotion. I did not regret the sacrifices I had made. But I finally understood that sacrifice without boundaries eventually turns into self-erasure. One afternoon, I gathered my documents and scheduled another meeting with my lawyer. Her office was calm and orderly, filled with shelves of neatly labeled files. She listened carefully as I explained what had happened, from the loan to the anniversary incident. She did not interrupt. When I finished, she nodded and suggested establishing a formal trust. It would protect my assets. It would ensure my wishes were followed. Most importantly, it would keep control in my hands. I agreed. Choosing a beneficiary required more thought. My mind returned again and again to Olivia, my 9-year-old granddaughter. She loved science kits, asked endless questions, and still believed adults always told the truth. With me, she was gentle and sincere. She never asked for anything. She simply enjoyed our time together. I wanted to preserve that innocence. I decided the trust would eventually belong to her. Not as a reward, not as leverage, as an opportunity. Before signing the papers, I wrote her a letter. I told her about her grandfather, about how we worked hard for everything we owned. I wrote about patience, responsibility, and self-respect. I did not criticize her parents. I did not mention conflicts. I focused on values, not resentment. When I finished, I sealed the letter and placed it inside the folder. Signing the legal documents was surprisingly emotional. As I wrote my name, I felt a sense of finality. This was not an act of revenge. It was an act of clarity. I was choosing stability over chaos, intention over impulse. When my lawyer stamped the final page, she slid it toward me and said quietly that everything was in order. I walked out of her office into the warm afternoon light, feeling lighter than I had in years. For the first time, my future belonged to me. Now, when I looked ahead, I no longer saw fear. I saw possibility. If you're still watching and inspired by her journey towards self-respect, please comment number 8 below to let me know you're with me. The final chapter reveals the true meaning behind every sacrifice she made. Now, let's move on to the ending. Several months passed after I finalized the trust. Life did not suddenly become perfect, but it became steady. My days settled into a gentle rhythm that no longer depended on anyone else's expectations. Mornings began with quiet walks through the garden paths. Afternoons were filled with reading, volunteering at the local library, and sharing small conversations with neighbors who knew me only as Linda, not as someone's mother or someone's burden. The absence of constant tension felt like learning to breathe again. From time to time, I heard about Ethan and Melissa through mutual acquaintances. Someone mentioned that his consulting business had struggled. Another said that Melissa had stopped attending certain social gatherings. Their names appeared less often in conversations, as if their lives had grown smaller after the night at the resort. I listened without judgment. I no longer felt responsible for fixing their problems. One evening, as I was watering the plants on my balcony, my phone vibrated in my hand. A message appeared on the screen. It was from Ethan. He wrote only a few words, asking if we could talk. I stared at the message for a long time. My first instinct was to ignore it, the same way I had ignored so many calls before. Not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. Yet I also felt a familiar ache rise in my chest. He was still my son. No argument, no betrayal could erase that truth. I did not answer immediately. I sat down, closed my eyes, and allowed myself to feel everything I had been holding back. The disappointment, the sadness, the love that had never disappeared, no matter how much it had been tested. I realized then that forgiveness did not require reunion. I could release resentment without reopening old wounds. That night, I wrote a short reply. I told him that I cared about him and hoped he was well. I did not promise a meeting. I did not discuss the past. I kept my words simple and honest. He responded with gratitude. We did not continue the conversation, and that was enough. In the weeks that followed, I became more involved in my community. I joined a book club. I helped organize charity drives. I volunteered to tutor children who needed extra help with reading. These activities filled my time with purpose that did not depend on sacrifice. For the first time in years, I felt valued without having to earn it through exhaustion. Slowly, I let go of guilt. I stopped replaying old scenes in my mind, wondering what I could have done differently. I stopped blaming myself for trusting too much. I accepted that love sometimes leads us into painful lessons, and that learning them does not make us weak. One afternoon, I sat by my window, watching the sun lower itself behind distant mountains. The sky shifted from gold to soft pink, then to deep blue. I thought about the woman I had been when I first moved into Ethan's house, afraid of being alone, afraid of taking up space, afraid of losing my place in my own family. That woman felt like a stranger now. I had learned to stand without leaning on anyone else. I had learned that peace did not require approval. It required courage. As darkness settled over the city, I turned on a small lamp and returned to my book, feeling calm, complete, and ready for whatever came next. One quiet morning, I woke before sunrise and lay still in bed, listening to the soft hum of the city beginning another day. There was no alarm demanding my attention, no schedule waiting to be managed, no expectations pressing against my thoughts. The light filtered gently through the curtains, painting pale lines across the walls of my small apartment. In that peaceful moment, I realized how far I had come from the woman who once measured her worth by how much she could give away. I brewed my coffee slowly and carried the mug to the window. Outside, the garden paths were empty, still wet with early dew. A few birds perched on the branches, unaware of the quiet transformation that had taken place in my life. Watching them, I thought about the long road that had brought me here. I had lost my husband and nearly lost myself with him. I had moved into my son's home believing that love required shrinking. I had accepted silence as kindness and endurance as virtue. I had ignored warning signs, convinced that patience would eventually earn respect. It never did. Instead, I learned that respect begins inside. Being called a burden, being dismissed in public, and being betrayed financially had stripped away my illusions. The pain had been real. The disappointment had been deep. But those experiences had forced me to look honestly at my life and ask myself whether I was willing to disappear quietly for the comfort of others. I had chosen not to. My thoughts turned to Olivia. Somewhere across the city, she was likely getting ready for school, tying her shoes with concentration, asking her parents too many questions, laughing at small discoveries. She did not yet understand the meaning of inheritance, trust funds, or legal documents. What I hoped she would understand one day was something far more important. That she mattered, that her voice mattered, that she should never feel obligated to accept disrespect in exchange for belonging. The trust I had created for her was not meant to rescue her. It was meant to support her when she stood on her own. The letter I had written was not a lecture. It was a reminder that dignity lasts longer than money. For a long time, I believed legacy was about what we left behind. Now I knew it was about how we lived while we were here. It was about setting boundaries without cruelty, about offering love without losing oneself, about choosing integrity even when silence would have been easier. I no longer carried anger toward Ethan and Melissa. They had made their choices. I had made mine. I did not need apologies to feel whole. I did not need recognition to feel complete. I had learned that closure does not always come from others. Sometimes it is something we grant ourselves. Later that afternoon, I opened the small wooden box on my dresser. Inside were photographs of Roger and me, handwritten notes from years past, and a copy of the letter to Olivia. I touched each item gently, not with sorrow, but with gratitude. They represented a life built with effort, honesty, and love. I placed everything back carefully and closed the lid. Standing there, I felt no regret, only clarity. If anyone ever asked me what I had gained from losing my place in my son's home, I would tell them this. I gained my voice, I gained my peace, and I gained the understanding that self-respect is the greatest inheritance any woman can leave behind. Sometimes, life teaches its most powerful lessons through quiet moments rather than dramatic endings. When everything has been said and done, what remains is not anger, regret, or resentment, but clarity. It is the understanding that self-worth cannot depend on how others see us, and dignity cannot be borrowed from anyone else. True peace comes from knowing where to stand, when to walk away, and how to protect what truly matters inside us. Every journey of loss, disappointment, and awakening carries a hidden gift, the strength to rebuild from within. It reminds us that love must never require self-erasure, and family should never demand silence in exchange for belonging. Growth often arrives late, but when it does, it reshapes everything. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched you, please share your thoughts in the comments. Do not forget to like, follow, and subscribe for more meaningful stories like this. Your support means more than you know.